Okay, welcome to Minivan Theology. And you may notice that it's daylight out right now. That's because I live in my minivan not just by night, but also by day. This week has been a lot of crazy snow stuff, like a lot of snow and nothing was canceled, and then no snow and everything was canceled. But anyway, it just messed up with the volleyball schedule. And so I didn't end up being in my minivan at night outside of volleyball, but I am in my minivan right now outside of the school. Always in my minivan. So anyway, refrigerator magnet series. We are on number 3, and if you're new to this, you can go back and watch the intro or one of the first ones and see what it's all about. But today is kind of a funny one. It's a little bit of a more obscure refrigerator magnet because I don't think that this one shows up as much in Churchland coffee mugs and totes and inspirational wall hangings. I think this more shows up outside of Churchland because it really is pretty wildly out of context. And so some of you may hear this and be like, that's not a magnet I've ever seen. But when you go out there and you look at sort of the top 10 verses and look for these things, this is one of them. And it's really, okay, so all that to say, let's just go ahead and say what it is. It's Romans 12:2, except it's not Romans 12:2. It's like, so in the Bible, you might get a verse, Romans 12:2, and then it might come in 2 sections. So you would say Romans 12:2a, and then you would just read the first section of the verse, or Romans 12:2b, and you would read the second. And that's accepted practice. In this case, I don't even know what to call it. The fragment that is out there is like Romans 12:2a and a half negative b. I don't know. It's the middle of the verse. It's super weird. So it is, drumroll, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Ah, yes. It sounds like something that I think Ben Franklin would say, or like, Thomas Jefferson. It sounds like a very sort of like old-timey, inspirational, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Woo, that's way out of context. So out of context. So I have been saying in this series, a verse on your mug is better than no verse at all. This fragment on its own is not better than no verse at all because it's way out of context and it's wrong the way it comes across. So when I say be transformed by the renewing of your mind, it sounds like something you're going to do. You're going to go out there and I don't know how you're going to transform your mind. You're going to be renewed. I don't know. You're going to like dig deep. You're going to find the truth within all that stuff that you see, that gobbledygook that's out there, how like deep down inside you have everything you need to renew your mind. And so when you do see this phrase out there on the internet, it's often like sort of with like, the bright lights and the inspirational sort of somber looking, serious, cerebral thinking kind of person. And this is like, you're going to go into some sort of, Zen state and just transform yourself. Okay, way out of context. So let's read the verse in context, and then we're going to jump out into the context of the actual book of Romans, and then go back a little bit. So there's a couple different versions because Romans is another letter from Paul, and Paul can get, he loves his words, he loves his big words, and so sometimes it's easier to read versions that have translated them into a slightly simpler version of English, but not maybe as technically precise. So Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That's from the NIV, which is a great translation. Let me read this to you from the New Living Translation, because this is an even simpler version, which I really like this translation. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Okay, so you see how the phrase is like right in the middle of that? Like it's after a whole other section and then before a section. It's a really long verse actually, and they just pulled out the middle. I don't know. That's a crazy one. But so in context, we have this verse. Don't copy the behaviors and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. And then you'll be able to know his will, his good and perfect and pleasing will. This is in Romans 12, and it's verse 2. And we're going to come back to why being verse 2 matters. But first of all, we need to think about the book of Romans. and it's a big book. It's a long book. I know I said Jeremiah was one of the longest books in the Bible. Romans is, it's there. It's another one of the long ones. It's in the New Testament, and it was written by Paul. Now, the last refrigerator magnet we did was also written by Paul near the end of his life. Remember, he actually wrote it from Rome where he was in jail. Remember, it was a book about joy, but he was writing it from jail. This is a book that he probably wrote in Corinth, but to the Romans. And it would have been a little bit earlier in his life, somewhere in the 50s, the AD 50s. And you know, it's a big one. Romans is a long, I'm just going to say, complicated book. It's systematic, though, and it lays out the gospel. It lays out what this faith is and how it works. It's kind of the nuts and bolts. Like, you know, you believe in Jesus, you have this faith. Okay, this is how it actually works, how God makes this a reality in your life. And so it's one of my favorite books. We actually had Romans quoted at our wedding. But it's long, and you know, so last year I taught the book of Romans to a group of women in a Bible study, and we spent the whole year. We went from September to May. Sometimes we only bit off like a half chapter a week. I mean, it's, you know, you can really dive into this. You can spend hours and hours on a verse, which I know you're like, oh no, we're just gonna do 15 minutes or maybe shorter if I talk fast. Okay, so Romans is here in chapter 12, it's near the end of the book. And so it is a little bit important to understand how we get up to chapter 12. And what Paul is doing is writing to the church in Rome, which has gone through a lot of upheaval. It's early in this Christian faith, this new faith in Jesus. And it's a mixture of two people groups. It's a mixture of the Jewish people and the Gentiles, which is basically what Paul and the other writers of the New Testament call everybody else. Because remember, the Bible is the story about God being in relationship with his people, but the Old Testament, the first half of the Bible, is about this specific people group, the Israelites, the Jewish people. And then this promise of being in relationship with God opens up in the New Testament to everybody else, and everybody else is the Gentiles. So some of you watching, you know, you may have a Jewish background. Every now and then when I teach this, somebody's like, yep, I come from a Jewish background. Great. You're in the Jewish camp. Everybody else, you're in the Gentile camp. Here's the thing. You're in one camp or the other, and both camps need help. And so what Paul does in Romans 1 through 11 is he lays out a whole system of how, doesn't matter if you're in this camp or in this camp, you're not good enough. Nothing that you do is going to be good enough, and you need Jesus in order to have this new life and to be in relationship with God. And he goes through all the different, like I said, the nuts and bolts of how that all works out. And he talks about what it takes to be in good standing, right standing, the fancy word is righteousness, relationship with God. He explains how the whole story works, what it takes to be in relationship. And that's good news, right? So he lays it out, chapters 1 through 11. It goes ups and downs, all kinds of, you know, digressions. Paul loves his digressions. I always say, wonder what will happen when Paul and I meet in heaven, because that's a conversation that could get a little crazy. And by the time we get to chapter 12, he's sort of gone through, look, nobody deserves this. Nobody can be in relationship with God by themselves. It's only through Jesus, only when Jesus gives you his heart, his life. And that's true for the Jewish people and for the Gentile people. You're all in the same boat. Get together, get along. You're one church now. And so then what? Well, then we come up to chapter 12. Now, chapter 12, verse 1. Remember, our verse is verse 2. But I said it matters that it's 2 because you got to look back at verse 1. I mean, you can't have verse 2 and not ask what verse 1's about, right? So, chapter 12, verse 1 starts with a very important word, and that word is therefore. Therefore. So Paul, chapters 1 through 11, he talks about the two camps and how God makes relationship with him possible for everybody. It's bad news. Everybody, you know, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That's early in those chapters. It's good news because now Jesus has come and a righteousness is available to all who believe. And so therefore, what? So what? That's what chapter 12 is saying. What do we do with that good news? Okay, well, I'll tell you. He says in chapter 12, verse 1, So therefore, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. And then he goes on to say, don't copy the behaviors and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. If you grew up in church land, you might have heard, therefore I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. You might have heard that word. Now, if you didn't grow up in church land and you hear all this news, this big news, it's bad, it's good, so now what? Well, live your life as a living sacrifice. You'd be like, womp womp. And that's sort of so therefore I'm supposed to be a living sacrifice. I mean, that sounds kind of crusty and ancient and frankly a little freaky, right? Okay, but the key word to this is the word living. The whole Old Testament, and this is true for all the Jewish people that Paul would have talked to and the Gentile people, because they come from a pagan background full of the Greek and Roman gods and that whole sacrificial system that was in pagan land as well. Sacrifice always ends in what? It always ends in death. I mean, you don't sacrifice something and then it's alive. So how can we be a living sacrifice? That's why it's the key word. Because what Paul has been teaching in the book of Romans is that Jesus was the sacrifice that died. And because he now lives, he gives that life to us. So what we're called to do with our so what, our therefore, all this news, and we're going to what? Well, we're going to live. We're going to act as people who have life, who have a new creation, and we're called to be living people in this world. Right now, we're called to live. Remember our first verse, from Jeremiah 29. I know I keep saying Jeremiah 20. It's 29:11. We're called to build houses and plant gardens. We're called to live even when we're in exile. And so this idea that we're to be a living sacrifice means that we're supposed to live and be alive, but for God. And why does that matter? Well, he gives us the contrast in our verse 2, because the world is going to say, oh, well, you should do the customs of the world, the patterns of the world. And he says, no. Do not conform or do not copy the patterns of the world. We are to be living sacrifices, which means living for God, because he's called us into this relationship, and we get to be alive because Jesus gives us his life. And so when it says don't copy the patterns of the world, that's because that's our human nature. That's what's so easy to do. I mean, I don't know, whatever the latest trend is on TikTok or Instagram or whatever you see in the grocery store, the magazines going to the checkout counter, whatever the fads are, whatever the trends are, that's easy to do. Do you know what the Greek word underneath this patterns of the world is where we get our word schematics from? It's schema. It has to do with sort of like blueprints. Well, what's the blueprint that the world tells us? The blueprint says, you go to the right kindergarten, you go to the right school, you get the right job, you go, marry the right person, you have the right kids, and they're going to be good because you're going to do the right things, and so forth and so on. And there's nothing to say my kids are in school right now. It is a good school. That's fine. But we don't need to follow the blueprints of this world. We are called to follow the blueprints of the world that Jesus calls us into, the world that he is both creating in the future and the kingdom that he has inaugurated and he's brought into existence now. And we're to be living sacrifices. Well, what's the sacrifice? The sacrifice is, not following the blueprints of this world. They're crazy pants anyway, and we know that. But it's hard sometimes. It's hard to not want to conform to doing what everybody else does, to be smarter and more beautiful and, better dressed in a snappier, drive. I'm in a minivan, so I can't really talk about snappy driving. But we don't need to conform to the patterns of the world. Instead, and this is where we get our phrase, we are to be transformed by the renewal of our mind, that by testing we may understand what the will of God is, good, acceptable, and perfect. Now, be transformed. That's a passive verb. It really is passive in the Greek as well. That means you're not transforming yourself. As a living sacrifice, you are being transformed by God. He's the one doing the transformation. This is the word transformation that we get metamorphosis from, like a butterfly, a caterpillar to a butterfly. So we're going from a caterpillar to a butterfly, or we're changing. But we are not the ones doing it. There's no diet plan, there's no degree, there's no, fancy job that you can get that's going to transform your mind. What transforms your mind is God. And this word in here that says be transformed by the renewal of your mind. The word renewal there is used by Paul another time in a letter that he writes to somebody named Titus. And he talks about the renewal and the regeneration by the Holy Spirit. It's just this showing very clearly that this renewal, this transformation, does not come from us. And that should be such good news. It should be such a relief. We're called to be alive. We're called to be living. And then God, as we are living and following him, is going to be transforming us to be more and more like him. And that's how we are then able to figure out what is the will of God, what is good, what is acceptable, and what is perfect. I mean, I couldn't pick out a perfect avocado at the grocery store if my life depended on it, let alone live a perfect life, right? I mean, perfect is a bar too high. Good news, God doesn't call me to be perfect. He looks at me and he sees the life and work of Jesus, and Jesus is transforming me to be more and more like him. And my response to that is to live, to be a living sacrifice, to go out there, plant my gardens. That's never a good analogy. Drive my kids, do the work that I'm supposed to be doing joyfully and for him as a living sacrifice, living my life. And so once again, this verse, placed right here in the middle of Romans, placed right here in this whole story, is about God being in relationship with us. I know Romans is a long, complicated, difficult book, and you know, if you have time to read it and you want to study it, that's great. It's one of my favorite books. But even if you just focus on these two verses, Romans 12, 1 and 2, it shows you God's plan to be in relationship with you and what your response should be. It's to live your life, but to live it knowing you're following him and he's the one doing the work that's calling us to be more and more like him and showing us what is good, what is acceptable, what is perfect, and calling us to those things. Okay, I think, it's a little over 15 minutes. I'm talking fast. That's what I got. I don't know. This is a minivan by day, so there you go. Minivan by day. It looks very much by minivan by night, just a little bit daylit. And I will see you guys again next time. Probably next time I will, in fact, be in a volleyball parking lot. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe on YouTube and share away. All right.